Welcome to Lessons Learned from 3 Generations of Feminist Leadership. It's part of the CRSJ Chair Chat series. We have 2 hosts today, myself, Drucilla Stender Ramey, and my daughter, Jessica Stella Ramey Stender. Before asking some loaded questions today, I want to first give a brief précis of the 3 generations we're referring to. First, we have Jessica's grandmother and my mother, Dr. Estelle Ramey, a woman who rose from Depression-era poverty to become a pioneering medical school professor and national feminist spokesperson. She was a woman who was described by her friend Ruth Bader Ginsburg as, quote, a brilliant, brave, and bold leader, radiantly and agelessly beautiful, a magnetic speaker, and a prolific writer. She stressed and practiced the transcendent power of kindness and of using your own power and resources to empower individuals and communities who have been denied power and resources. She was also a very witty person who was known occasionally to ruminate about what her doctor son and lawyer daughter might have made of themselves if only they hadn't had a working mother. I am Drucilla Stender Ramey, the 2nd generation here, a former MALDEF litigator, law school dean, executive director of the San Francisco Bar and the National Association of Women Judges, and with a lifetime of leadership in groups like the ACLU and our wonderful sponsor today, CRSJ. And saving the 3rd and best generation for last, we have my daughter, Jessica Stella Ramey Stender, a transformative civil rights lawyer working as policy director for Equal Rights Advocates and co-chair of CRSJ's Rights of Women Committee. Jess was formerly the legal director of the Centro de los Derechos del Migrante in Mexico City and is so like her grandmother in her brilliance and all-encompassing compassion and driving passion for justice. So, Jessica, first question. Lily Tomlin once said, you know, I always wanted to be somebody, but now I realize I should have been more specific. So my question to you is, what impact, specific or otherwise, have your forebears' personal and career successes and failures and the often unexpected obstacles that we dealt with had on the pathways you've chosen to follow? Or did we give you a bum steer?
Definitely did not give me a bum steer, which I just learned what that means. You guided me well. I, of course, am incredibly lucky to follow in the footsteps of you as my mother and grandma, as we call her, but Dr. Ramey, in terms of seeing kind of really clear examples of how one can create a career that is not just a job, but is actually something that you feel connected with and that you're passionate about and that can make a difference. I also got a great example in both of you in how you can be a strong woman and face challenges within and within certain occupations. In this case, in the medical field, in the case of my grandmother, and then law, in the case of you, my mom, and kind of really seeing an example of how you can still persevere despite the challenges you might face as a woman, and also challenges you might face or think you'll face as a mother, and have kind of really appreciated being able to see that one, at least in some circumstances, that there is a way to balance those 2 things, having a career that you care about and that you're passionate about, and also having a family that you love dearly and being able to try to balance those 2 things. A few other kind of takeaways that I have from both of you is really the importance of mentorship and really kindness. And I learned that, from my grandmother really as a child, and I guess very young adult, but just really hearing how frequently she would take people under her wing to encourage them, to support them. And in that field, in the medical field, it was often kind of a dog-eat-dog world, and it was seen as weak potentially to ask for help. So she would take it upon herself to help people who maybe needed a bit more support. in achieving their goals and maybe just needed a little bit of help to get where they needed to be. And also going out of her way for people who weren't even in the medical field, such as I believe it was one of a receptionist who worked for her that she kind of affirmatively reached out to and helped to create a new career path that helped her kind of get into a different place in her life. And then really have seen, of course, you, my mother, kind of really carrying on that tradition of offering people help along the way and acknowledging that it isn't a zero-sum game. We can all succeed and do well. And the importance of really supporting other people, women, but also other people in their career paths is so important to ensure that everyone has a chance to kind of make their way and have a career they love. A third takeaway.
I just wanted to interrupt there about the kindness thing with grandma. And my favorite story of that is my brother, also a doctor, of course. My brother was playing handball, or one of those things that guys do where you don't know the person you're playing with, or racquetball maybe. Anyhow, it with another doctor that he had, and they introduced themselves to each other. They didn't know each other. And the guy was, in fact, a very prominent doctor in Washington, D.C., where my brother and mother lived. And when my brother introduced himself, this other guy, the prominent doctor, he said, "Are you Estelle Ramey's, my mother's son?" And my brother said, "Yes." And the guy sort of teared up and he said, "Your mother is the reason that I'm a doctor today." And he told the following story. And this sort of slops over into the affirmative uses of power and kindness. In this case, the guy had done very well in his first year and a half of med school, but his father suddenly died and he failed 2 subjects, one of which was anatomy and one was my mother's topic, physiology. He was allowed to take them over again in 2 weeks, but if you can imagine this, he hadn't entirely recovered. And so he failed both of them again. And he went to see the anatomy professor, a guy, and the anatomy professor basically said, you really just don't have what it takes to be a doctor. Have you thought about, I don't know, dentistry? At which point, he then went to see my mother, because if he passed one of them, he'd be able to continue in medical school. And he told her his story, and she looks at him and she says, "Well, Mr. Jones," she says, medical students tend to think that medical school professors, are like Zeus on the mountain, that we can just hurl down a thunderbolt and change the complexion of everything. She said, and for the most part, that's just not true. She said, but every once in a while, there's a little something to it. She says, "Take you, Mr. Jones." She says, "You just passed physiology." And the man was a doctor 35 years later. So I interrupted you, Jess.
No, I love that story because it's the perfect example of both my grandmother and also of you, in terms of not just, as you said, not just, helping people, but really using the power that you have when you can. And this is discussed a lot in the field of law and other fields as well, that beyond just mentoring someone, it's very important to be a sponsor and to really affirmatively take steps to give people opportunities to, be in that courtroom or attend that deposition or whatever that opportunity may be that will help them develop their career in ways that they may not have been able to. And especially, of course, we know that women, people of color, others who aren't always given the same opportunities in the law, really need that type of sponsorship, in many ways. So I really love that example. And I've seen you carry it out and have tried, as I've advanced in my career, to not just kind of provide mentorship to law students or new lawyers and kind of helping to try to teach and impart some, information about practicing law, but also providing opportunities to have new experiences and to strengthen their legal skills in different ways. And then the last point I'll make is really just, this is something that my grandmother talked a lot about, is the importance of luck. That's not something you can really create, but she talked a lot about the fact that as a woman in science, during that time, there were very, of course, few women in science. And while she was incredibly smart and worked incredibly hard, a lot of the opportunities she was afforded were really just based on luck. And as she put it, based on men who understood that a woman's worth was, not based on her gender, but based on her intelligence and her contributions, and really she talked about the fact that it was actually a lot of men who opened doors for her to achieve the accomplishments she was able to achieve. And I think that translates into now that you can work really hard and be very smart, but also there's a little bit of luck in achieving success.
That happened to me at the ABA when I first took the Bar Association job as head of the bar. I really knew nothing about the American Bar Association, absolutely nothing, and it was clear that it was important to get to know the powers that were and that are now in the ABA. And unbeknownst to me, a guy who was a leader of all things, the Beverly Hills Bar, who I did not know, but who had met me in those first few months, just decided to take it upon himself to make sure I got on prestigious committees. So I never knew for many years how it was that I was appointed to these kind of sought after committees. And I do remember he said, now be sure, he said later on when he finally revealed himself, years later, he says, listen, forget about getting on committees where it's something you already know about. He said, for example, get on the Constitution and Bylaws Committee of the ABA. He says, they don't do much, he said, but they go to great places, and anybody who wants to be the president of the ABA goes through that committee. It will stand you in very good stead. And sure enough, the first meeting, well, it was in Bermuda, and the second meeting was in Palm Springs. And sure enough, that's where I met several of the people that to this day have been enormously helpful to me in my career, both within the ABA and the larger legal community.
Well, that actually is a great segue because we're going to kind of switch off on questions here. So my question to you is, how much of your life, both kind of career and outside career life, has been a result of careful planning?
Very little. Very little. Now, I came from, unlike my mother, a kind of a privileged background. So even if I stumbled all the time, there usually would be somebody there to pick me up, which is not at all true for many of the groups still struggling to get a foothold in society and, of course, in the legal profession. But be that as it may, the fact is most of the things that have happened to me that are good things really were complete surprises, and often in the wake of what I saw as bad things. For example, my first job was with a little old left law firm in Oakland that I ended up at because Hillary Clinton, who was then Hillary Rodham, who was a classmate of mine, said they hired women. This was in 1972. So I went to work there. I was lawyer number 6, and they really couldn't afford a 6th lawyer. We represented the Panthers and all kinds of interesting clients, but most of our clients were lower middle class residents of Oakland who really couldn't afford a lawyer. So, it got very nerve-wracking coming into the reception area and not seeing anyone there because there was my salary, my non-existent salary. So finally, I just went in to see my boss and said, Bob, I said, you all need to lay me off. You can't afford me, but you're just too disorganized to lay me off. So I'll lay myself off if you give me a really good party. And the old left were great at parties, especially at the house of my boss. So they gave a great party, and people would say, God, it's a great party. I mean, what's this about? And I'd say, it's my getting laid off party. But I met several people at that party who were friends of my bosses, who later stood me in very good stead in other jobs that I had, but that I met in the layoff party. And then, as fate would have it, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund was opening an office, in its main office, central office in San Francisco, moving it from San Antonio. And so I applied for and got that job. And it was really just a sort of a serendipity thing. Later on, I ended up teaching law for quite a while, years before I ended up a dean. And I kind of thought it was a sinecure for life because, you could, I'm sure it's different at maybe Harvard Law School or something, but at Golden Gate Law School, I had time to do things, particularly since I wasn't going to write the tome of the century, legal-wise. I had time to chair the Commission on Women and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, what I thought was a sinecure for life wasn't, and they laid off the bottom 2 2/5 of the faculty because they went into a financial crisis. And it was, last in, first out. And so at first that was very disheartening. And it certainly wasn't anything I had planned on. But then my husband, your father, who is a great feminist himself. So, the bar, I saw he's in the legal paper that the bar was hiring a new executive director. And I don't think I was a member of the bar at the time, or if I was, I certainly wasn't active. I never would have seen it, but he did. And as it happened, the incoming president was a guy that had been the vice chair of the ACLU the whole time I'd been the chair out here. And he knew me really well, although I didn't know very many kind of white shoe guys like that. And the head of the hiring committee was the woman who founded California Women Lawyers and had drawn me into that as a perfect stranger way back when in my third year of law practice. So, the fix was in. So all of a sudden, there I was in what was clearly the best job I had ever had up until then, and to this day is the best job I ever had. So I would say, both getting laid off, but then getting hired in even better jobs are things, neither of which I planned, but there it was. I didn't plan to marry your father, although I knew him well, and his then wife was a very prominent lawyer. But once their marriage was over, as it happened, I was invited to be on the most prestigious committee of the Bar Association of San Francisco way before I became executive director. The president of the bar called me and said, "Do we want you?" And I thought, yeah, sure, I'm young, but he must see something in me. Well, it turned out he thought I was a Chicana because I was at the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund and spoke a little Spanish. So I was put on that committee purely by mistake. And your father happened to be on that committee as well. And that's how we really got to know each other. So life has a way of sort of happening, whether you plan it or not, especially if you don't. What is that expression? Man plans, God laughs. Well, that's kind of been the case for me. On the other hand, when you really want to do meaningful things, you do plan. Like at the bar, it turned out that these big firms would hand their money over to you for almost any plausible program to achieve equality, for example, because they didn't have the time to put together these programs. But if you did, and you would really take their money and do with it what they would do if they had the time, then they'd hand it right over. So there you do plan. But again, sometimes things go awry anyhow, and somehow or other, with any luck, it works out and you end up better off than before whatever mistake you made.
Well, I'm glad that you touched on some of those examples, because of course we can't really control luck and what opportunities present themselves, on a lucky basis. But I do think the examples you mentioned also show the importance of kind of taking a chance on an opportunity that may not have been something that you had thought of or planned to do, and really kind of trying it out. And often, I think, finding, at least in your situation, I know this has happened for me, that an unexpected opportunity really can turn out to be a really wonderful and fulfilling career.
Like Tina Fey says, say yes and you'll figure it out later. And women right. do that as much as men do. A guy will be offered something that was really outside of any of his experience and say, yeah, I could do that. Women, much more often, even now, basically say, well, I don't really know anything about that. And so maybe, you'd do better to get somebody who does. And my feeling is, when you're faced with something like that, think about what a really arrogant white guy would say in response to an offer that is outside of your bailiwick, but something that it would be awfully nice to do.
Right. That's a good point. There's so many examples, and I think studies on this showing that women often will see a list of requirements for a job or a promotion, and although they fit 99% or 90% of those qualifications, because they don't have every single qualification listed, will forgo an opportunity. So I think it's really important, that reminder that we should take advantage of these opportunities, even if there may be something something newer to us.
Yeah, and and of course there's it is harder for women and people of color and people with disabilities in the LGBTQ community. It is harder sometimes because you fear that if you fail, then you will have failed lots of other people in your particular group that has been marginalized, and so you feel you have to be more careful. But the economies, the external economies of trying something and probably succeeding at it are much more. And you do have to overcome, of course, a lot of the implicit bias that people talk about. I, of course, am someone that thinks a lot of what's called implicit bias is quite explicit bias. And in fact, I was talking to the managing partner of an extremely prestigious firm and I said, say, do you all teach about implicit bias and do that training and so on in your firm? He says, yeah, we do it. And I said, do you think it makes a difference? He says, well, he said, maybe at the margins, maybe so. He said, but here at XYZ, we really don't have to worry that much about implicit bias. He said, because, we have so much explicit bias. And this was a managing partner who'd really tried to do something about it. So there are, built-in headwinds, as the Supreme Court said in Griggs versus Deuce Power all those years ago, that you do have to face and be realistic about, but you got to take that leap of faith if you possibly can. So I have a question for you, Jess. Tell me, people listening to this, what are the most important issues that you and equal rights advocates and your colleagues have been working on in Sacramento and beyond lately, and with what success and with what troublesome failures occasionally?
We at Equal Rights Advocates work here in California, but also in other states and at the federal level to advance the rights of women and girls and people across genders. We focus on workplace rights issues, usually issues related to discrimination, harassment, pregnancy accommodations and discrimination, leave, those kinds of issues. And then also on the education side, we advance education equity. So we focus on the rights of women and girls and really students across genders around protections against discrimination, harassment at school. And we represent workers and students to try to support them in their fight for their rights. Most recently filing a pay equity, class action pay equity lawsuit against a prominent gender equity institution of higher ed, and other lawsuits on behalf of workers.
One of the sisters, who shall go unnamed, yes.
And on the policy side, we work to advance legislation at the state and federal level here in California and in other states, and also the federal level, to combat discrimination at work and at school. We just wrapped up the legislative session here in California with some really exciting wins in the gender justice realm. I'll highlight just two of them, which the first deals with the issue of retaliation. And we know that workers, even though retaliation is illegal under state and federal law, workers experience retaliation at very high rates when they speak out about their rights around equal pay or minimum wage or overtime or whatever the labor protection may be. And so what this bill that was just signed into law by Governor Newsom would do, it's SB 497, and it would strengthen our existing retaliation protections to better protect workers. We know that retaliation is a fear for workers of all wages. And in fact, workers of all wage levels experience retaliation. And it can be, of course, very harmful. Everything from, having your hours cut to being demoted to actually being fired just for speaking out about your rights. But it has a particularly kind of harmful impact on low wage workers who don't have a safety net, if they are fired or have their hours cut for speaking out. So this bill, SB 497, which will take effect next year, will advance kind of and strengthen protections against retaliation for workers in California when they're asserting their rights under the California Equal Pay Act or other labor code protections like minimum wage, overtime, rest breaks, etc. The other bill I'll highlight that just got signed into law by Governor Newsom is AB 933. And it addresses a really troubling rise in survivors being hit with retaliatory defamation lawsuits when they speak out about sexual assault or sexual harassment or other forms of harassment or discrimination based on race or national origin or whatever it may be. And, you know, in the wake of Me Too, we saw this really important kind of increase in people feeling comfortable to come forward and talk about harassment or assault that they'd experienced, and really feeling more empowered to do that. But unfortunately, with this increase in these retaliatory and really often baseless defamation claims, we're seeing that they're really having the intended effect. Of course, the intended effect of silencing people, because the survivor doesn't have money to get a lawyer to defend against this type of claim. And, you know, even if the survivor would ultimately prevail after litigation, that comes at the cost of, you know, the actual cost of paying an attorney, but also the kind of re-traumatization of relitigating the issue and the harassment or the assault that they experienced. And it really also has a chilling effect on other survivors who see what might happen if they speak out and choose not to. And we hear about this at Equal Rights Advocates really frequently from workers and also increasingly from students who speak out about assault. And we're not talking necessarily someone who wants to talk to the press, although maybe someone wants to talk to the press, but really just, you know, in the case of a student filing a Title IX complaint with their school, just asking for a protective order to not be in contact with the person who harmed them. And we're really seeing a lot of people calling us saying that they've been hit with these defamation claims and not having the resources to defend against them. So this bill would, and now, you know, signed into law, it takes effect next year, will increase protections to try to better protect against these types of retaliatory defamation lawsuits. Those are just a couple examples. Here in California, we just to name one more, we passed a new paid sick days law to increase the number of paid sick days from 3 to 5 that workers in California are entitled to. And in California, workers can use paid sick days, you know, for their own illness, for that of their child or family member, also for preventative care, like a mammogram or a COVID vaccine shot, and also finally for paid safe days, so that survivors of domestic violence can use those paid sick or safe days to get a restraining order or other types of protections. So 3 days was not enough. 5, you know, is still not enough, but it's better. And it gives workers more time, and really prevents workers from having to make these very horrible decisions about, you know, going to work sick or, you know, losing their income or sending a kid to school sick, or possibly losing their job. So that's another win here in California. And then in other states, we've supported a number of states in passing pay equity laws, stronger pay equity laws, similar to what we've done in California, as well as stronger anti-harassment laws, among other things. And then finally, at the federal level, as I'm sure will be of no surprise to the listeners, there is not a lot of room to get bills all the way through right now in this Congress, but we did just celebrate a huge win after a decade of effort, collective effort, advocates across the country, in getting the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act signed into law. And that took effect this year. And that will, of course, ensure that pregnant people across the country have the right to reasonable accommodations, and they are therefore less likely to be pushed out of a job should they need some type of reasonable accommodation. So it's the type of law we've had in the books in California for many years and in some other states, but now workers across the country will have that important protection. And then finally, I'll note another win, because it's an important one, is the infrastructure law that was signed into law last year. And that, of course, ensures that we have billions of dollars of infrastructure funding. And we at ERA, along with our partners, are working to ensure that women are given access to those higher paid jobs in infrastructure as a result of that federal win. So that's a little example of what we're doing at Equal Rights Advocates with partners here in California and across the country. And you can check out our website for more about that at equalrights.org.
So I guess the last thing is to talk a little bit about the importance of diversity in the legal profession, particularly in light of the disastrous opinion in the United States Supreme Court on affirmative action. But suffice it to say that the legal profession is really about the most segregated in this country as to gender, as to race. especially as to race and national origin and other formerly protected classes. And some of the diversity efforts, many people listening to this would not think that being, the head of a bar association or the women judges organization could really be very helpful in this area. But it really is astonishing how much the kind of local geographic bars and state bars, especially local bars, can pour into resources like the California Minority Council Program, which we started years ago at the San Francisco bar, the school to college program, where we would send inner city kids from San Francisco all over the country to visit four-year schools to convince them and their parents that there's money out there and opportunities available. And I guess we're almost out of time, but one anecdote that, when you're the head of a bar association, you know a lot of things about these people who run law firms and general counsel and stuff. And for the school to college thing, we needed frequent flyer miles. We decided to go after lawyers for their frequent flyer miles to send these students to, particularly to the East Coast. So I called up this one guy, and he said, he says, I can't give you my mileage. My wife would just kill me. And I said, well, that's funny, Harry, because just last week, you and I were on a 7 a.m. flight from San Francisco to LA, a 50-minute flight, where you used 20,000 miles to upgrade to first class. And, they didn't even serve champagne at 7 a.m. in the morning. So don't tell me that you don't have some frequent flyer miles to spare for some kid who basically does not have anything like the opportunities that your kids have, and that kids who are not in these environments have. So you can really, in whatever job you're in, you can have more or less power to really make a change in the lives of a lot of people in what is a very stratified and very discriminatory society still. So I guess that's kind of it, I think, time-wise. I may be wrong, but I think so. So Jessica Stella Ramey Stender, thank you so much. And the section for civil rights and social justice, the absolute most wonderful section in body, in my view, in the ABA, and the most courageous. Thank you for this opportunity. And that's it.
Thank you.